Welcome back. I'm Ziad Ali for Java Object-Oriented Programming. Today we're gonna talk about constructors in Java classes. A constructor is a special method that is used to initialize objects. Actually, when you create an object in Java, you call one of those constructors. Constructors can also be used to set initial values for primitive data types or other objects. One class can have multiple constructors. Every time you call the new keyword, you are actually calling one of the constructors of a class. When you call a constructor, you are creating the object. Here's an example. We see the constructor in this class circle. This is the constructor. It has the same name as the class name with no return type. And when you say new, you are actually calling the constructor. When you call a constructor, you get in return an object of the class being called. A constructor must have the same name of the class, no return type, no default, no return value. They are typically public. They can take 0 or more parameters. In these two examples, the constructors are 0 parameter constructors. However, in the second one here, we see the constructor takes 2 string objects. You still can create a Java class without a constructor, because Java will define one automatically for you. And that constructor is called the default constructor, which is a constructor with no parameters. Let's see this class circle. It has no constructor. However, Java will create a default constructor for you that takes no parameters, exactly like what you see here. I have an empty circle class here. I'll declare the radius, public double radius. I'll create no constructor. I'll just call a method, public double get area, and return math.py times radius squared. That's it. So my class now has no constructor. However, Java will create a default constructor for you. So let me test it. I'll go to the tester here, the app. I'll create a new circle object, circle, C1 equals new circle. That's it. At this moment, I'm actually instantiating an object from the class circle. The object name is C1. I'm using the default constructor. Although I did not provide one, Java did. I can continue working with the object. Let me set the radius and try to get the area. A1.get C1, sorry, dot get area. Let me run this code. Let me save. So the area is as you see here. Default constructors are also useful to initialize values or booleans or even objects. You can set any initial value for any primitive data type or an object in your class. So here you can set any initial value inside the constructor. So whenever the user creates a new object, those values will be set. You can even call any private or public method in the class. If you don't set the values, numerical fields will be set to 0, boolean to false, and objects to null. You have seen the example how to use the default constructor. You just call the new circle, which is the class name. Here we have a triangle. You just create a new triangle object by calling the new operator. So when you say new, you are actually calling the default constructor in these two examples. Sometimes the constructor is expecting parameters from you. So a constructor which has specific number of parameters is called parameterized constructor. Why we need it? Because you need sometimes to provide the values the very same moment you are creating the object. Let's see an example. Here we have a parameterized constructor which take radius as a parameter. So we don't have a default constructor in this circle class. So when you create a new circle object, you must provide a floating point value for the radius. This is how you use it. You provide a floating point value that is going to be used to set the radius. You cannot now call this class using the default constructor. Same example here. We have a rectangle class that has no default constructor. You can call it, but you need to provide two values, one for width and the other for length. You no longer can use the default constructor. Why? Because if you define a parameterized constructor, Java will not define a default constructor for you. You need to do it manually. Let's see this in the next slide. Constructor overloading is providing more than one constructor to the user. Here in this example, we have two constructors in the same class. One is a default constructor, the other one takes one parameter, which is double for the radius. Constructor overloading is a technique of having more than one constructor with different parameter lists. Each constructor can perform different tasks. You can call only one constructor when you instantiate an object. They are usually differentiated by the compiler depending on the number of parameters and the types of those parameters. Let's change the circle class by adding another parameterized constructor. Here is the circle class. I will add a parameterized constructor, no return type, public circle, double R. I will say radius is equal to R. At this moment, you can create circle objects, but only using this constructor because the default constructor is gone. So let me go to the tester. We will see error here. Why? Because no default constructor in our class. So the only way now is to use it with the parameterized constructor. No need to set the radius now. So now when you call it, this value will go to the constructor here and the radius is set. Let me run this code. Excellent. Let me go back to the class now and manually add the default constructor. Public circle, open close, and that's it. Now you have two different constructors in this class. You can create a new object using either of them. Let us do it this way. Now let's create a new circle object using the default constructor. Circle C2 is equal to new. Now when you say new, you can call either of the constructors. I'll call the default one. That's it. Now I can set the radius for the second object, and then I can output the area. So that's what we call constructor overloading, which is providing more than one constructor to the class. This is how you call the default constructor. And this is how you call the parameterized constructor. Let's see another example here. Here we have a class with three different constructors. The first one is a default constructor. The second one is a parameterized constructor that takes two parameters. The third one takes three parameters. So if you want to create an empty student, you call the first one. If you have the first name and last name and you need to send them with the same call, you can use the second one. If you have the GPA, you can call the third one. Let's do this in code. Here's the class UniStudent. I'll just paste the attributes. Now let's create the three constructors: public, UniStudent. This is the default constructor. Second one takes first name and last name, public, UniStudent, string, first, comma, string, last, and from here you can set the values. I can say fname equals first and lname equals last. The third constructor is almost the same as this one, so I'll copy it. I'll just add the GPA. See now, if you try to use the same constructor with the same number and types of parameters, the compiler is going to say this is wrong. No need to provide two identical constructors. So GPA is double. I'll say G here. I'll do the same and say that just GPA is equal to G. Now there are three different ways how to create a student object. Let me go to the tester. I can now create a UniStudent. U1 equals new. Which constructor to call? Let's start with the default constructor. You can set the values now. First name, last name. I forgot to make them public, so I'll just put public here for all of them. That's why I could not access them from different package. U1 dot first name is equal to Steve. U1 dot and last name, for example, is equal to Jobs. And you can set all the other parameters. Let's see the second constructor. I create a new student object, UniStudent U2 dot equals new student. Now I need a new UniStudent. The class name must be correct. Now, if you put control space, you will see all the available constructors. So the first one is the default, second one takes two strings, third one takes two strings and a double. I'll use the second one. So I'll say here, Bill, comma, for the second parameter is going to be Gates. That's it. I created the second object using the second constructor. I will do the same for the third object, but using the third constructor, U3 equals new UniStudent, control space. If you want to remember the order, this is string, string, double. Then this is going to be Tom Hanks, and his GPA is 3.4. That's it. So we created three different objects using three different constructors. This is called constructor overloading. It provides flexibility to the user. If you don't want the user to use different ways to access or to create an object, limit this by providing only one constructor. So this is our class default constructor. That's how we created the new first student. Second constructor, two parameters, and that's how we did it The third constructor takes 2 strings and 1 double. Of course, if you do not provide or define a default constructor, it's gone. Default constructors are added only when no constructors are available. Here we're going to see an example of constructor overloading, but also using constructor chaining. We're going to use constructor chaining to avoid duplication of code between constructors. This was the case in the previous example. The same code is done in the second constructor, and it was also done here. You would say, okay, no problem, it's just 2 lines. No, but sometimes this could be very complicated. Even 2 lines, you should not repeat the same code again and again and duplicate it in so many places. This is a core concept of object-oriented programming. So what we're going to do now, instead of repeating these 2 steps, we would call the previous constructor with the first name and last name. The previous constructor is going to set them, and we continue working after this. So this code is going to change now. Let's see how it's going to work. Look at our code. This is our code. We have 4 constructors now in this example. The default constructor, no need to do anything. The second constructor takes first name and last name. Fine, we set the first name and last name. The third constructor takes first name and last name and GPA. So to avoid repeating this code, I will call the previous constructor from here with 2 strings. Using the word this, when you use this with number of parameters, the compiler would look for what? For a constructors with that signature. So now here, you are actually calling this constructor with first name and last name. So the constructor here, the code inside it will set the values. After it finishes, it will come back here to continue doing the remaining tasks. Here's how it works. You are calling the other constructor and then continue setting the other things. If you look at the fourth constructor, takes GBA and male and last name and first name. So instead of repeating the code again and again, I will call the previous constructor with these 3 variables. The previous constructor is going to call the one before it with only 2 and set the third one. For the last constructor, the only thing I need to set is the email because this is the only new thing in the constructor. Here is our university student. Let's just remove this now. Instead of duplicating the code, I will say this and first, last. The compiler is going to look for a constructor that takes 2 strings, and this is the constructor that takes 2 strings. Let us make a fourth constructor now. Takes first name, last name, GBA, and string. I'll call it male. So now I will call the third constructor with GBA also, and only I need to set here the email is equal to male. This is called constructor chaining. Each constructor calls the previous one instead of repeating the code, and that's why the fourth constructor is going to call the third is going to call the second. We can go ahead and create objects now in the app using any of those constructors. Let me use the fourth constructor, uni student, u4 equals new uni student. If you forget the sequence or the order of parameters, control space, this is the one I'm looking for. See here, you see it now. Good. I write my name. Does that make sense? So now we are using 4 constructors, not only constructor overloading, but also chaining. Hopefully you got the idea of constructors in Java, the default constructor, overloaded constructors, and constructor chaining.